Happy New Year everybody, welcome to my first tutorial video of 2018. Yes it is, and guess what I'm going to talk to you today about, today? Sharpening, yeah. More methods of sharpening and how we can apply different methods of sharpening to different sort of styles of image. And here we've got a picture of a white-tailed sea eagle in flight, and it's open in Lightroom, and if we take it up to a one-to-one view first off, we can see that yes, it's critically focused. The lens has done its job, the autofocus system's done its job, and if we notice over here in the details panel, we've got no sharpening applied. Okay, now here we are at a one-to-one view. I'm going to take this up to a 4-to-1 view, and we'll scoot over to the head area. Actually, we'll go back and drop the magnification again. It isn't the best composition you've ever seen, but it's okay. But it was actually shot with the 200-400mm lens that I was using. It was actually shot wide open at just shy of, I think, 350mm. And as you can see, whoops-a-daisy, go back to a one-to-one view, we've got limited depth of field. We've also got, as you'd imagine, we've got areas of low frequency detail, areas of high frequency detail, and all in all, we've got limited depth of field. And we want to apply sharpening to this image just to bring out the nth degree of detail. Shot on a 1DX, so you know we can't really afford to do too much in the shadows, otherwise we'll start bringing out noise and pattern noise and colour noise and all that sort of malarkey. And we don't really need to put an awful lot of sharpening on it, but if we put sharpening on in Lightroom, let's go and apply the default sharpening that Lightroom does on import. Don't want any masking. And yeah, you can see now it's critically sharp at 1-to-1, at 100% resolution. But if we take this up to a 4-to-1 view, you'll notice on the darker, higher contrast edges between the high frequency detail and the low frequency detail, we are starting to get a sharpening halo. And I don't know if video compression is actually showing you that there. So what we'll do is we'll take it up to an 11-to-1 view, and hopefully you'll be able to see the halo there. So we can't use masking to reduce that halo because it just doesn't. You can still see the halo here. That's about 1.5 to 2 pixels wide, and so masking doesn't work. And I'll show you in a minute why the masking doesn't work. But if I go to my favourite deconvolution sharpening, the single iteration deconvolution sharpening, you can see we've still got a halo, and we've made a slight light halo on the light side of the edge and a dark halo on the dark side of the edge. So things aren't looking very good, but we've got no real way of controlling where that sharpening is applied inside a Lightroom, because it's just been applied in equal amounts across the entire area of the image. And obviously we don't want any sharpening in the low frequency detail areas vis-a-vis the sky. So what we're going to do is kill all that sharpening off, and we're going to scoot the image over into Photoshop, and I've already done that, and here it is. And what I want to do here is just give you a rough idea of how sharpening works and how those halos actually come about. And I'm going to get my brush tool, and I'm just going to do a rough XY axis. Now ordinarily in this current state, if I actually go in and zoom into a huge magnification, now we can see that we've got a tonal ramp across this edge here. This tonal ramp, this fuzziness, if you like, to the edge doesn't occur in real life. Nothing's got a fuzzy edge in reality. And really and truly, in the days of film, we didn't suffer with this. Certainly not to the same degree as we suffer with it now. We're using digital sensors for recording our images. And it all stems from the fact that each one of these squares here, or each one of these pixels, corresponds to a photosite on the sensor. And a photosite can only contain one value of brightness and one value of colour. Can't contain more than one of each. So the actual tone and coloration of each one of these square pixels is set. So your problem arises when we start to apply sharpening to an image. It can't really find the edge, it doesn't know where it is. All Photoshop or Lightroom knows is that the edge is somewhere between here and here. So with regard to this graduation ramp, if we like, this diffusion ramp here, if I come back out to a one-to-one view and come to my axes again, then if I get my brush tool, what's actually going on is we've got, coming out from the hard edge of the beak, we've got a ramp, and then we've got the brighter sky. So here we've got this part of the beak here, just underneath the cross of the cursor, and it's dark, and then we've got this diffused edge which is getting brighter and brighter and brighter until we get to the tonality of the sky, low frequency detail, and Bob's your uncle. Now when we apply sharpening, it would be really nice if all we were doing was affecting the gradient or the angle of this gradient here. And up to a point, that's what we do, because the angle of this gradient is what affects the contrast of the gradient. So if we can make the lighter side lighter and the darker side darker to a degree, then things are looking good. But sharpening doesn't work that way. What sharpening actually does is this, and it puts a little dip in there and makes the dark side go darker. It then steepens the gradient, in other words increases the contrast across the edge, and then makes the light side go lighter, and then bump, like that. So outside of the radius of the edge, our darker side doesn't change and our lighter side doesn't change, but within the radius of that diffusion ramp, that edge ramp, across those diffused pixels, what we're doing is we're shortening or narrowing the width of them by increasing the contrast, but then we put this white halo on here and this dark halo on the dark side, and this is what causes our sharpening halos. It's very, very simple. So I'm just going to go and delete that layer, and I'm going to duplicate this layer, and we're going to look at a particular method of sharpening inside of Photoshop called Smart Sharpen. And Smart Sharpen's had a load of bad press ever since it was first created, and I must admit that I contributed to that bad press quite vehemently, and to be honest I still do, because if we come up to Filter, Sharpen, and we pull up Smart Sharpen, and here's the Smart Sharpen dialog box, and I'll just talk to you about this in a minute. But Smart Sharpen, the one thing I dislike about it intensely is the name, because the one thing Smart Sharpen isn't is smart, but it does enable you to have a certain amount of subtlety and control over where the sharpening is applied to the image. And if you go and open up Smart Sharpening, your Smart Sharpen dialog box, when you open it up, will probably look something like that, and like that, and like that, and there we go. It'll probably end up, when you open it up, look something like that. So what we're now able to do within Photoshop, first off, is to expand this dialog box just by clicking and holding on that bottom corner and dragging our cursor. This makes a big difference. We don't really need to have the preview checked, because all that does is throw the effect of the sharpening onto our main image in the background, which is a RAM intensive operation. So we don't really need to be doing that, because we can now see this really large view of our Smart Sharpen dialog box. And the other thing is, what we need to do is go and open up that shadows highlights box. And if we have Smart Sharpen in lens blur mode, because if we click there, we've got motion blur, which it tries to remove motion blur and it's rubbish. In Gaussian blur mode, it's somewhat akin to unsharp mask, but in lens blur mode, it's doing the same single iteration deconvolution sharpening that we can do in Lightroom with a radius of 0.5 and the detail slider all the way over at 100. But the only thing is, we can actually vary the amount of sharpening deployment within the shadow areas and the highlight areas to a degree, and I stress that, to a degree. It's not the world's best method of sharpening, but it can be quite effective if you want to do something quickly. And the way I use Smart Sharpen is basically this, like this. I turn the amount all the way up to 500. I turn the radius down to 0.5. So I'm using the same value as I have in Lightroom. And I remove all this default reduce noise. I have noise reduction turned off. And now you can see we've got an awful lot of sharpening on there. Looks quite effective at 100%. And if I click and hold, there's the unsharpened image, there's the sharpened image, and it looks really good. But if we were to try and do a print off that, it would look awful. What we can do is we can blow this image up, and I've not finished increasing the size of it yet, but obviously we need to look and concentrate on these contrast boundaries here, where we've got hard edges and also where we've got relatively soft edges. And here you can see we've got a sharpening halo on both the light side and the dark side of the high frequency detail, low frequency detail boundary. We will also start to suffer with halos here, but the contrast difference between this area here and the sky is a lot less. Therefore, the white and black halos that we associate with the sharpening, because of what I've just shown you with the little graph, they aren't as apparent there as they are here. So if we can get this area looking alright here, then we don't really have to worry about halos remaining up here or on the beak area. So we're going to look at the highest contrast boundary, and we're going to blow it up to its maximum of 800%. And so we can clearly see we've got some white haloing and we've got some darkening. Now then, this is where Smart Sharpen sort of becomes quite interesting, because we can actually fade the amount of sharpening. We can fade it in the shadows, we can fade it in the highlights, and we can also dictate the tonal width of shadow and highlight that fade takes place over. It's not as distinct as it could be. if we actually fade the amount by 100% in the highlights and the shadows, and then take the tonal width of the highlights and the shadows up, if I click on, off, you can see we've actually turned all the sharpening off. So this tonal width here is actually the top 50% of tones in the image, and this tonal width in the shadow area is the bottom 50% of tonal width within the image. So basically we can't afford to have them both running at 100%. Really and truly, I think that these shadow and highlight areas should only actually cover the bottom 20% for the shadows and the top 20% or 25% for the highlight. And I'm sure there is an Adobe engineer out there who could sort that, but of course none of the Adobe engineers are actually photographers. Yeah, so there you go. Yeah, but I bet they'll say they all are, because they take 500,000 pictures on their smartphones every week. But anyway, there you go. So what we need to do is we need to be able to control the sharpening within the Smart Sharpening module. And I'm just going to actually reset everything down to 0. And let's start with the dark side of the edge. And let's take its fade amount first of all up to just over 50. And then let's take the tonal width to just over 50. And can you see it started to disappear? Let's fade it some more, because this is quite a high ISO shot. It's done with a Canon 200-400mm lens on a Canon 1DX Mark 1, and so as I mentioned a lot earlier in the video, I don't really want to put any sharpening in the shadows, not really, because all I'm going to do is exacerbate noise faults that are in the shadows anyway. So I'm sure you'll agree that we've actually not negated the dark edging, but we have taken it down somewhat. What I'm actually going to do is make the shadows virtually disappear, or make the sharpening in the shadows virtually disappear. We don't really want to touch the radius, because if we turn the radius up 100%, if anything, it makes the dark pixels come back again. So we want to keep those turned down to 1. We can't turn them off, can't put 0 in there, we have to have a value of at least 1. Now what we want to do is just have a look at these white edges here, and I'm going to take the fade amount up to about 50%, and we'll take the tonal width up, and now look at that. Now those white edges are gone. We've also affected some of the darker tones on the dark side of the edge as well, and if I turn that on and off, there's off, there's on, off, on, off, on. So you can see we are still actually applying sharpening to the image. So I've actually made a couple of presets, because whatever value you put on these sliders, we can come up here to preset custom and click the little twirly arrow, and we can go save preset, and we could save it, give it a name, and then we can come back to it anytime we want to. I've actually already got one set, which is mids 1, and I'm just going to leave it like that. This is the sharpening on, that's off, on, off, on, off, on. And if we come up to the eye, on, off, on, off. Go over to this beak area over here, yeah, on, off, on, off. So if you want to try these settings on one of your own images, then please feel free, but have a play around with the slider values in here inside of Smart Sharpen. It has improved over the last couple of iterations of Photoshop. I don't quite know what it is that they've done, but improved it has a little bit, but it still hasn't got smart. It isn't smart, it's as thick as a brick. Okay, so just remember that. And if we come over onto this lower contrast edge here, if I turn it off, we can actually see more of the halo on the sky side of the boundary than if I let go. Yeah, so it's not bad. So I'm just going to click OK, and there's our smart sharpening applied. And if we scoot across this image and we come into these shadow areas here where we would be prone to noise, if I turn that sharpening off and then turn it back on again, you can't see any difference, but you can see a bit of a difference in the feet, even though the feet are somewhat out of focus. But if we look at the eye and the general head area of the bird, that's sharp, that's unsharp. Video compression might not be able to show you this on YouTube, but at full resolution the difference is noticeable. So there you go, Smart Sharpen. It's not smart, it's had some real bad press, including off yours truly in the past, but it's another little tool that you can have a play with and deploy on some of your images. For goodness sake, don't deploy it on landscape images. It doesn't work very well. It's not as effective on a landscape image as it is on this sort of wildlife image, where we've got a bird, as we've got here, against a relatively low frequency detailed background. So anybody who's into birds in flight, go and have a go at using Smart Sharpen in Photoshop. So I hope you enjoyed that lesson, hope you found it useful, and if you have, go click the subscribe button, click the ringety tingety bell thing to get a notification of the next video I put up, and I shall see you again very soon. Tooroo.